Welcome to this reading. This is Professor Smith, and I will be recording the book After Polygamy Was Made a Sin, The Social History of Christian Polygamy by John Cairncross. Polygamy was forbidden after Roman papists took over the church. Isaiah 4 tells us the Astra strongholds denying every believing woman a good husband will be overcome at the last. Enjoy, and may the Almighty Yahweh bless you. Okay, welcome. We are continuing this Life for Polygamy, Lacer, the chapter and Christian Polygamy book that we've been going through. There's a lot of interesting history here. As I've said before, we're going to jump right in. If ever the conditions for reviving polygamy laid down by medieval theologians were fulfilled, it was in Germany after the bloody 30 Years' War. From 1618 to 1648, the land was ravaged in a fierce battle between Catholics and Protestants, and to make sure that neither side downed the other and ended the war, foreign allies lent a hand, chief among them Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. When peace was finally signed, the adult male population was reduced to a small, if willing, band, totally inadequate for the needs of the women. And so it was that at Nuremberg on the 14th of February, 1650, the Regional Council of Catholic Franconia decided, with the approval of the Archbishops of Bamberg and Würzburg, to limit the admission of youths to monasteries and to encourage priests to marry. Possibly even more startling was the decree authorizing laymen to take 2 wives for the next 10 years. This was justified by the need of the Holy Roman Empire to replace the male population destroyed by the sword, illness, and hunger. The councilor realized that bigamy might disturb the peace and amity of households, for they prudently added that husbands were to observe seemly behavior, to make proper provision for both wives, and if this was entirely in the men's power, to avoid ill feelings between them. The new regime was interconfessional, since it was endorsed by the local Protestants. How it worked and how long it lasted is not known, but it may be surmised that the circumstances that gave rise to it had roughly similar consequences in other parts of war-ravaged Germany. What is certain is that the famine of men for these 30 years and for many a day afterwards stimulated interest in the whole issue of polygamy, which seems to have lain dormant for the first half of the century. Yet the revival was some time in coming. Books started to appear on the subject in the late 60s, but with the pro-monogamy orientation, it was only in 1673 that a writer, concealing his identity under the pseudonym of Sincerus Warembergius, took the opposite side in a tract entitled Discursus de Polygamia. Even more significant, the anonymous author had recourse to a well-worn stratagem to avoid arousing suspicion. He pretended that his essay was merely an adjunct to a refutation of polygamy by a certain Genosius, who adopted the high-sounding appellation of Christian Vigilius, and even had the effrontery to suggest that his work enjoyed the endorsement of that authority. As to Gonesius' view, there was not the slightest ambiguity. He flayed the pernicious and rapidly spreading new doctrines on polygamy, which, he alleged, were imported from Sweden and were infecting the purity of German morals. The Writers' Guild of the New Heresy, he declared, should have their hands sewn together to prevent them from wielding their pens in such a nefarious cause. Under cover of Gonesius's impeccable sentiments, which were printed in large type, Sincerus smuggled in his own views, reproduced in much smaller print as befitting their secondary importance. The man behind this ingenious maneuver to outwit the watchfulness of authority was called Johann Lycerus, or, if the Latin ending is dropped, Lacer. He was born in the Saxon city of Leipzig in 1631 and came of a distinguished family of scholars and divines. To start with, he showed every sign of following worthily in their footsteps and held an important post, probably in the Lutheran Church. He appears to have been subverted by a Swedish nobleman called Count Konismark, who was tired of his wife, Nee Wrangel, and was eagerly seeking a way out of the marriage, divorce being out of the question at the time. Armed with an annual pension, he left his post and joined the Count's suite. On Königsmarck's death, Lacer traveled widely in Holland, Sweden, Denmark, France, England, and Italy. All that is known of his wanderings is that he served for a time in Denmark as an army chaplain, and when discovered preaching polygamy and peddling his books on the subject, he was promptly expelled by royal decree dating the 15th of March, 1677, and forbidden to return on pain of decapitation. His writings were seized and burned by the common hangman, and a German pastor, Schluter, was commissioned to compose a refutation of his doctrines, which was published the same year and is completely unreadable. It cannot have been a comfortable life, but he managed to survive on what he scraped together from the odd pension and from earnings from his remarkable skill at chess. Even so, a good deal of his meager resources went on research into his favorite topic. We know that he spared no pains to accumulate material for his books and always consulted the best libraries. In fact, Laser must surely be unique in history. Just a reader's note here. I'm not sure what this is pronounced. It might be Lyser, but they've got it. The phonetic here is Leyser, but I think probably it's more Lyser. Polygamy was for him the be-all and end-all. His work is really a single book in which the same arguments are repeated, elaborated, or amplified over and over again. He was mastered by a consuming passion to which, with missionary single-mindedness, he devoted the whole of his life. But it was a purely intellectual passion. It was unkindly said of him, scarcely vigorous enough to cope with one wife, let alone several. There is nothing astonishing about this disproportion. As Bailey, the great French critic, observed in a review of one of Lyser's books, some people delivered the most fiery attacks on polygamy, but are the first to deceive their wives. It is a serious mistake to seek to gauge a man's soul by his writings. To the outward eye, Lyser was indeed a rather pathetic figure. He was diminutive, frail, thin, slightly hunchback, but more from sickness and traveling than because he was born that way, and he was usually downcast and nervous and rambling in his talk. Yet some of his writings, especially his earlier ones, are eminently readable and, consciously or no, highly diverting. His first work, Discourse on Polygamy, is like Ochino's famous composition in the form of a dialogue between an advocate of polygamy and a monogamist. Not surprisingly, Lyser goes to endless trouble to persuade the skeptics that several wives need not be more expensive than one. For even in those days, there was a marked disinclination to marry at all, on the very material ground of the crushing additional expense involved. In dwelling on the concrete blessings flowing from marriage, Lyser he probably realized, following faithfully in the footsteps of Luther himself, though the former, to be fair, only had the orthodox form of matrimony in mind. Many more men became rich, Luther had observed, who marry in God's name, than rich men remain rich, who wed for the sake of lucre. And again, following in the great theologian's footsteps, Lyser makes his case with very down-to-earth arguments, as the following summary shows. How can the wretched husband manage single-handedly to deal with a horde of wives? We can bear our cross in this world. In any case, one cock can cope with several hens and impregnate them too. So it looks like this is answer and question kind of thing here. Now here's the question. Who will feed the wives? Answer. Consider the lilies of the field and the fowls of the air. Go to the cock, O thou of little faith, and ask him who feeds the hens. On the day of judgment, the Turks and Gentiles will resuscitate and accuse Christians of lack of faith. Though God's message as regards polygamy is clear enough, nowhere does the Bible say that one man should be limited to one woman. Here's the question. No doubt, but women will never accept polygamy. Here is the response. I'm not sure exactly what this M and P stands for. Maybe it has to do with point and counterpoint or something like that, but this last one is interesting. No doubt, but women will never accept polygamy. Indignantly. Did not God set men in authority over them? In any case, women will submit to it if properly indoctrinated. And look at all the sins that spring from monogamy. It drives women to arrogance and domination over men. What is even more serious, monogamy leads to onanism, by which lyser means intercourse with sterile or pregnant women. Abortion, infanticide, whoremongering, and adultery. All these could be abolished if polygamy was admitted. In the end, unable to resist this torrent of eloquence, the monogamist declared himself completely one round. But Lyser was far from satisfied with his first blow for the cause. In 1676, he brought out another considerably amplified version of the dialogue in German, called as a tribute to his patron, Königsmark, Das Königlich Mark aller Länder. Now, I think that's German transliteration there, but you'll have to excuse if it's not quite correct. The royal essence of all lands. This was dedicated to the state authorities and church dignitaries as being those best fitted to introduce, promote, and protect polygamy. But the honor shown to the powers that be has a sting in its tail. If he threatens them, they reject his doctrine and suppress the truth. He will turn to the heathen. They will one day arise and condemn you, for so hath the Lord commanded us. This dialogue, like his earlier effort, gets to grips with the practical aspect of cost right on the outset. And here is the first thing. What about the difficulties of keeping several wives? So it's like question answer kind of thing. And here is his answer. You can adopt a step-by-step approach. I'm not suggesting that you should take 5 or 6 wives in a quarter of an hour. Jacob waited for 7 years for his first wife and another 7 for a second. Actually, I don't think that's correct. Jacob waited 7 years and he was expected to get Rachel, but he ended up getting tricked to get Leah instead. But he threw a real fit about it, and Laban said, well, work for me for 7 years and fulfill her week, which means after 7 days, Jacob took Rachel on debit, essentially. He had to work the 7 years course. And still later, he took the 2 sisters' maids. Polygamy is not, of course, compulsory. It depends on the man. If he cannot be satisfied with one wife, let him take another. If he has an old, sterile Sarah, let him take a young Hagar. If he has gotten into a tangle with Leah and Rachel, let him marry both in order to keep his word with one and save the other's honor. If he sees a beauty among the Philistines or on his travels, let him carry her home. God did not force polygamy even on Adam, but it was his intention to create several women for him had not the first man been led astray and been forced to leave Eden. It is in any case absurd to hold Adam's one wife, looks like a menage, as a blinding example. Adam walked about naked and was married without a priest, without any relatives being present. If we were to follow this example blindly, what fools we would be. In other words, he's making the case that the entire argument that, well, Adam only had one, therefore, and he had no priest, he had no certificate, he had no marriage license, so on. In other words, without questioning that, then you're rather foolish. But the monogamous is still worried about maintenance. Okay, so here is the claim. All this would be fine if the man did not have to feed his wives. That's the claim. Here's his counterclaim. This is a wicked doctrine. It often leads men to despair and makes them loathe marriage. It leads to adultery on the part of women and makes them uppish. On the contrary, women should feed the men who can, if need be, show the women how to run their homes and feed themselves. It is doing the woman a great disservice to imagine that they can't fend for themselves. If that was really true, they would be worse off than the senseless brutes. How do widows and single girls manage? Women must do as they are told when the husband order them to work. After all, everyone has a duty to work. He who works not shall not eat. Look at the examples of the patriarchs. Jacob was badly fed before he got married. He had nothing but a staff when he crossed the Jordan. But when he took 4 wives, he became inordinately rich. Solomon is another case in point, and he can speak from experience. If a father can feed 10 or 12 children, why can't he provide for as many wives, especially if they lend a hand? But how can I keep them under control? Okay, this is the point of the those who are resisting the idea. And here's the answer. If a man can run a whole kingdom, why can't he keep order among a few sensible women, bound to him by ties of love? Anyway, the women will do everything without being forced to, out of love for their men. They will be far easier to keep in hand than one wife who feels that her husband must kowtow to her, however hideous and surly she may be. If there are several wives, they will all compete for their husband's favors, just as Jacob's wives fought for his. But it will be difficult to satisfy them sexually. That's the next, basically, the counterpoint of the monogamy-only viewpoint. And here's his answer. How do you know that women are insatiable? A well-brought-up woman who is neither a whore nor sterile will be happy once she has conceived and no longer be keen on intercourse, as is the case among certain animals. In practice, men often sleep with their wives even after they are pregnant. This vicious practice may lead to the loss of the child and should be punished by death. Sometimes, out of love, the wife allows sexual intercourse, and after a time, the couple get used to it. But usually women complain if the men persist, and the result is often a quarrel. True, women are occasionally insatiable, but this is only before they have children. Look at Rachel's exclamation, "Give me children or I die." Man has no obligation to satisfy immoderate and unseemly desires on the part of women. In any case, difficulties are just as common in monogamy, where the most ardent of women often has to put up with a weak or half impotent husband. Turkish women get along among themselves in the same house. Why shouldn't Christian women do the same? Interesting point there. He's pointing out the Turks who, at this time adopted Islam, and they allow up to 4 wives. And he's making an observation here. He must have been there and observed these kinds of households. Says Turkish women get along among themselves in the same house. Why shouldn't Christian women do as much? Very interesting. Polygamy not only makes men and women more healthier, happier, and richer, it also increases population. Procreation is a divine command. A ram reproduces itself several times over the course of a year with its ewes. So does a canary. If there were ever one female, the male would never leave her in peace, and she would therefore not conceive, a common illusion in that age. With several, he should have offspring every time, and monogamists cannot produce the maximum number of children. It might have been thought that men should moderate their ardor, but Lyser is convinced that semen degenerates if not put to use, and that it is a kind of wealth, which it is criminal to allow to run waste. Very interesting. Many conservative groups have this similar view. That polygamy is part of the divine plan is clear from the fact that God created woman for man from a man's rib. But since there are several ribs, a man should obviously have several wives. But polyandry for all polygamists is definitely banned. The Bible says that a man cannot have 2 masters, but it never says that a master cannot have 2 servants. Since woman is the servant of a man, it follows that he can have several wives, but a woman cannot have several husbands. However, male rule over women should not be that of a tyrant over a slave, but paternal, as of a father to his children. If Solomon had many wives, it was because all his allies offered him the most beautiful damsels when he visited them, just as 400 years ago the king was always given the fairest maiden whenever he entered a town. Not only is there nothing in the Bible contrary to polygamy, the fathers of the church, Augustine and Jerome, did not condemn it in the Old Testament. In early Christian times, it was common. Look at that admission. Now, this is someone who understood church history in the 1600s, noting that in early Christian times, it was common. See, that's an incredible proof right there, because and here we are 2,000 years removed from the first century church, second century church. Exactly when they began to clamp down is somewhat questioned. I think 600 AD was one where I saw the Roman church began to really clamp down on the practice. But that leaves, you leave, 500 and some years where Christian husbands had more than one wife, and that it was common. According to this writer in the 1600s, he's a lot closer to the source than we are. So there's no reason not to believe him. Even Charlemagne had several wives. It was only the evil spirit which prevented polygamy from becoming customary. Gradually, priestcraft became more and more powerful. It is all the fault of the devil and Rome. The church imposed not only monogamy, but the celibacy of the priests and also church control of marriage, which had formerly been a civil affair. Now, that's an interesting admission, too, isn't it? Because it underscores a belief among many who study the history of the church that the church usurped its rightful authority because Christ said himself, he said that marriage belongs to God. You see that there were certain things that were above that were above religious authority. That marriage is regulated by God itself. Okay. Let's see. In 1532, Charles V made polygamy a capital offense, and the Council of Trent ratified the condemnation of the practice, and yet whoremongers and adulterers go scot-free. How wickedly unjust. He's making some powerful arguments here, isn't he? Under this accumulation of evidence in support of plural marriage, the monogamist inevitably gives in and docilely admits that he is utterly convinced. In other words, let me put it this way. Under this accumulation of evidence in support of plural marriages, the monogamist inevitably gives in and docilely admits that he is utterly convinced. In other words, if you really pin one of these guys down and they really have an open mind, then they have to concede. But that doesn't mean they're going to change their viewpoint. It just means, well, logic has got them in a corner and they can't get out of it, at least at this moment. But this lively and controversial approach, Leiser evolved to a more academic type of polemics, and instead of providing both Latin and German versions of the work, he confines his writings to Latin, and thus limits his appeal to the learned alone. Isn't that interesting? That this was only, so in other words, the only people that were really talking about this, based upon his work, were really the ecclesiastical intelligentsia. These people that understood Latin, they had some church training, they had language, not the common people. However, in a few passages, he forgets his grave erudition and gives free rein to his enthusiasm. In one such flight of eloquence, he lists the possible beneficiaries of polygamy, which it is almost superfluous to explain, includes just about everyone. Plural marriage is indicated, for example, for husbands, since it will make them live happy to a ripe old age. It will help expand the family fortune. The wives will vie with each other in bringing up the husband's children and thereby avoid the temptation to be unfaithful. It helps young men, for they can tranquilly marry girls whom they have seduced while drunk. Wives will have their arrogance and ill temper put down, as well as their other vices and their virtues in mind and body. But increase, girls will have everything to gain because it will be easier for them to marry, and their health and reputation will no longer run any risk from their enforced singleness. It will help the traders who fare to distant lands and are obliged to keep their liaisons secret to the great detriment of the state and their conscience. Poor sailors will be able to marry another wife, possibly a rich one. The old will renew their youth like the eagle at the contact of a beautiful Abigail. Children whose mother is absent or ill will be reared by another woman of the household, a far better arrangement than the use of servants, and parents will have an easier time bringing up their children and finding husbands for their daughters. Farmers will have many more trusted hands to help them till their fields, and kings and nobles will, like Solomon, extend their power and wealth by fruitful alliances. Pastors will benefit since there will be more baptisms and marriages. The church will gain with the decline in infanticide, whoremongering, and uxoricide. And the Gentiles and Turks will flock to the true faith once polygamy is no longer forbidden. A very interesting thought there, huh? That if the Bible is actually obeyed on this, and that the freedoms allowed in God's law were actually obeyed by the church, it would actually act as an incredible attractive element. Imagine how many Muslims might come to the faith if they knew that the natural inclinations of man and of what God has shown us in his law were allowed. Leiser quotes the case of Cochin, which would have been converted to Christianity had not the Jesuits insisted on the king abandoning all his wives but one. This he firmly refused to do, and threw the missionaries out of his kingdom, for which the priest will answer at the day of the last judgment. The state will gain, since there will be more farmers on the land, especially as there are many uncultivated spaces. Besides, there is no king who would not like to have more subjects than he has, no merchant who does not desire more customers, and no landowner who would not wish to have more farmers. After this work, there was a long silence, no doubt due to Lyser's travels to England, Italy, and elsewhere. Okay, so this basically is segueing into this next part here. So, in other words, this concludes all of the philosophy and thought process that this individual, Lyser, when he was writing this back and forth question and answer kind of thing, that was sort of his format. And so then after this, there's a great silence. He doesn't have a whole lot that historians can discover from him. And so he goes to England, Italy, and elsewhere. He appears in print again only in 1682 with his magnum opus, Polygamia Triumphatrix. Looks like Triumphatrix. Polygamy Triumphant. Even in liberty-loving Holland, he apparently had to avoid the limelight. He still used a pseudonym, Theophilus Alethius. It looks like Alethius. Theophilus Alethius. And the book is ostensibly published at Lund in Sweden, whereas it was in fact printed in Amsterdam. But then the paladin of polygamy had fallen on evil days. He eked out a miserable existence in a garret, racked by a fever which held him in its grasp for 6 long months. The front piece of Polygamia, that it was published at the author's expense, but legend has it that he was paid the derisory sum of 20 ducats for it. Either way, the treatise was a labor of love. So that's something. He labored all that time to collect all that information, and he only got a very small sum for his work. It is certainly no masterpiece. Lyser readily admits that his Latin lacks the Ciceronian elegance. I think that Ciceronian means, I think Cicero was either a lawmaker or a poet. I'd have to look that up, but it goes back to the days of Rome, where you have really elegant kinds of Latin used among the educated classes. Cicero was one such. But what it loses in polish, it makes up in its prodigious erudition, which would be it's very detailed. This fat quarto volume of over 500 pages is a jungle of recondite footnotes. Hardly a detail exists which is in any way connected with polygamy, but is recorded in these pages, hardly an authority, from the early fathers of the church to the German reformers and to the writer of his own time, Selden, the English Old Testament scholars, Grotius, the learned Dutch jurist, or the French man of letters, Hourier, better known as the author of the Eroticum Aloysia, for Lyser was nothing if not up to date. His all-embracing span of knowledge makes his work a summa of the sexual lore of his day. The infibulation of Sudanese women, the special devices needed to enable eunuchs to urinate, the doctrinal implications of nocturnal pollutions for priests, the more esoteric details of the cult of it looks like Priapus. All these curiosia and innumerable others tumble from his pen in a welter of perverse argumentation. It's pretty verbose, isn't it? What is more, the work was by no means despised in the time. It caught the attention of most European capitals. It was reviewed by Bailey in his highly respected Novelas de la République des Lettres, okay, published in Amsterdam. Now, you have to excuse some of my pronunciation. Some of this is other languages that I'm not really familiar with, but I do try to pronounce as it's transliterated to the best of my ability. Though put it on par with a treatise advocating fever, Bailey had clearly worked his way through the book and gave a very balanced summary of its contents. It was long quoted as a standard work by any writer, and there were many dealings with polygamy. 35 years later, it's still rated a respectable, if negative, mention in looks like Montague's Persian letters. Some passages, too, are eminently quotable. In one memorable disquisition, Lyser indulges in a fervent defense of Solomon, the multi-wifed. Even if he argues the king had as many as 1,000 women, he cannot be accused of neglecting them. By an ingenious calculation, he demonstrated that, assuming a reign of 40 years, Solomon had 146,000 royal knights at his disposal, and hence he devoted 146 knights to each of his wives, which, thinks Lyser, is an equitable ration. It is to be hoped that Solomon was as vigorous in the performance of his marital duties as Lyser was in his use of the slide rule. By most of the book, but most of the book is less diverting. It is permeated by a paranoid hatred of women. In Lyser's eyes, modern man is a slave to the caprices of the female. He opens his book with a hymn to liberty, but a very strange kind of liberty. There are, he explains, many kinds of slavery, but none as vicious as the domestic tyranny of wife over husband. The domination of women is utterly intolerable, being against all the nature and reason. Yet today it is common, even in the provinces, where the Dutch have paid such a high price to achieve independence. Liberty in the home can only be brought back by polygamy, under which women will outdo each other in pampering their husbands. As things are, the poor man is often given such a terrible time that he is afraid to come home and wanders off to taverns and other haunts to seek solace. And there he consumes his substance in dissipation. Here, the wife says, call me at home. She knows that there is no escape for her victim. Come back he must, since divorce is out of the question and a second wife is not allowed. If there were a second wife, the husband's subjection would vanish in a flash. It is clear that for Lyser, women should be man's slaves. She should have no right to leave him, even if he is impotent. She should be locked up and beaten if he so decides. Her desire should be disregarded. In any case, she exists only for the man to impregnate her, a self-respecting girl. Lyser has always maintained, will not expect intercourse after she is pregnant. He has a horror of immodest dress and dwells with delighted disgust at the evil of the low, very low, necklines current at the time. Women should refrain from kissing as a form of greeting, then very common in most northern countries. They should live in seclusion and not go out in public, and they should never, never sleep in the same bed as their husbands. If the world is racing down the slope into the moral abyss, Lyser has his explanation pat. It is all the fault of the love of luxury, of which women are the main exponents. This deflects men from marriage, inclines them to bachelordom, and encourages fornication. If polygamy were restored, women would have their wings clipped, and the general craving for luxury and soft living would be arrested. Lyser, like all men and women with a fixed idea, ultimately degenerated into a maniac. Yet, like many one-track minds, he was by no means ineffective. He had very wide connections, and he maintains that he had long conversations with numerous divines and scholars on his pet subject. Many of these revealed in private talks their conviction that polygamy was not contrary to God's word, but were loath to come out with the public profession for fear of ridicule and hostility. In this list of celebrities, Lyser naturally includes himself, since no one was supposed to know the author's real name, but he also mentions such soaring thinkers as Spinoza, the pantheist philosopher, and Pufendorf, a 7th century jurist. Reader's note. Very interesting, very similar today. When you discuss these issues, not even from a liberal standpoint, perhaps outside of the what could be deemed somewhat abusive viewpoints that Lyser held, you have, privately you can get a pastor to agree, oh yeah, it's not biblically wrong, but get them to say that at the pulpit? That's not going to happen. His assertions are not to be rejected out of hand, and as we shall see, there's one famous name cited by him as a sympathizer for which the case can be proved. As for Pufendorf, in his major work, De jure nature, this is Latin, I think. De jure nature et gentium, 1672, he rejects the idea that polygamy is contrary to natural law. It should be frankly admitted, he says, as is the case with certain writers, that the objection drawn from the example of the Old Testament patriarchs constitutes an insoluble difficulty for those condemning polygamy. It is just as ridiculous, he goes on, to regard as distressing the lot of women in Asia where polygamy is current, as it is to consider a deplorable that of the peasants or artisans, because they do not have a choice, they do not have as choice a life as the nobility. A woman, now this is interesting here because readers note, from his standpoint, he's saying that economic status is no indicator of allowances. And his argument is such that women, and perhaps there were some women who brought in an income themselves. Maybe they own land from a previous husband that had passed away, and so on. Maybe they now, of course, this would vary through European countries. Some were more liberal than others. But the notion at its nexus is that rich men should not be entitled to this right alone. That's it. That even poor men might even increase their economic status if a well-managed house of multiple wives who all have various businesses suggest maybe, even something as simple as a farmer. You've got more hands to handle the animals and till the ground and plant and reap and so on. And so this is his argument. A woman should have no scruples about marrying a polygamist where this is the established custom. Pufendorf quotes freely from certain writers in question. These include the Dutch jurist Grotius, who wrote, "When God permits a thing in certain cases and to certain persons, or in regard to certain nations, it may be inferred that the thing permitted is not evil in its own nature," i.e., polygamy, right? Readers know. Another such authority was the Englishman John Selden, who had demonstrated that polygamy was permitted by Mosaic law, was also practically universal in ancient times. It is worth noting that Pufendorf is, like Lyser, a Saxon, was born in the year after him, was, like him, the son of a Lutheran pastor, studied theology at Leipzig, Lyser's birthplace, and spent a great deal of his life at the time when Lyser was composing most of his work in Sweden. It is almost certain that the two men knew each other. More intensive research, too, might well confirm the belief that Spinoza looked with favor on the practices of his Jewish forebears. He was brilliant and original Old Testament scholar, and he had numerous friends in the Dutch Anabaptist community. But even Lyser's conviction that he was not alone in the battle was not enough to help him over his ill health and his run of bad luck. The end came soon after. In a letter from Paris, dated the 31st of October, 1684, Macias, the chaplain to the Dutch embassy in the French capital, gives the depressing story of his end. And this is speaking of Lyser. 2 years ago, on his return from Italy to France, Lyser called on me and complained of his poverty. He asked me for help without disclosing anything about his conduct or his name. He sent for me urgently. I found him sick of mind and body and tried to relieve both. He seemed more concerned for his soul than for his life, for he wished to confess his sins and to receive communion. But he put this off to the following day. Finally, at Macias's insistence, he confessed that he was an exile from Germany and an ecclesiastic. Quote, "The poor man, feeling slightly better, went off on foot to Versailles and see some former court patrons, hoping to obtain a pittance from them. At least he expected to gain something from his skill in chess. He was mistaken. His friends abandoned him and poured scorn on him. Ill and penniless, he tried to get back to Paris, but his strength failed him, and on the way his illness became so much worse that he was unable to finish the journey on foot. He was taken to a house nearby, where he breathed his last soon after." Unquote. Even when so exhausted, Lyser had been pressing on with his crusade for polygamy. One of his friends passed on the dead man's papers to Macias, who was horrified to see that he was preparing, quote, "a new, subtle, and pernicious work on the subject." Needless to say, nothing is known of these unfinished notes. What sins Lyser had on his conscience, we do not know. He had never regarded himself as other than a pious Christian. In fact, like most sectarians, a far better one than all the rest, precisely because of his peculiar beliefs. He constantly insisted that he had been impelled to write not by love of gain or by carnal desires, as was indeed obvious, but solely to promote his version of the truth and prevent the host of sins that followed in monogamy's train. "My conscience," quote unquote, he declares with messianic solemnity, has compelled me not to hide my message or keep it from the world. And he ends his masterpiece by calling down the thunderbolts of heaven on those who know the right and do the wrong, and by an appeal to God to forgive him his shortcomings. O Lord God, who soundeth the hearts of men, I desire nothing but that your most holy name be no longer profaned, that sin diminish, and the true Christian way of life be introduced. My only aim is the glory of thy eternal name and the salvation of the church and of souls. I deplore my lack of zeal and my negligence in using the talents entrusted to me in order to spread the gospel. Amen. Only to God is the glory. Providence may have forgiven him. Posterity was less indulgent. After a moment of fleeting notoriety, it relegated Lyser's works to the lowest shelves of a handful of well-stocked libraries, where they have steadily gathered dust for the last 200 years. He deserves to recover at least a small measure of his former glory. Now we have a part here that is titled "Lyser Finds an Ally." It's Beger. I think it might be Beger or Beggar, without translation or transliteration notes here. It's difficult, some of these names. They are European, obviously. Lyser was not the only voice raised in favor of polygamy. A fellow German, Lawrence, we'll say Beggar, followed a similar path. The analogies between the two men are striking. Beggar's book was published in Amsterdam, like Polygamia Triumphatrix, for 3 years earlier. Both men used a pseudonym, Beggar concealing his identity beneath the Latin appellation of Daphnaeus Arcurius. Both sought to avoid the odium attached to subversives by recourse to a ruse. Beggar's title runs to half a page, but it can be summarized as important considerations on Christian marriage, and his work met the same fate as some of Lyser's books. It was sentenced to be burned by the common hangman. It is unlikely that Beggar was overly worried at this reaction by authority. In his own corner of Germany, he felt safe enough, for his disquisition was composed to justify the extramarital union of his patron, Prince Karl Ludwig of the Palatinate. To do him justice, the author was pleading more for divorce than for polygamy. He is free on the whole from Lyser's obsessive misogyny and often verges on feminism. Marriage, he says sensibly, is a union of mind and body and does not exist if these conditions are not fulfilled. In reality, it often seems grimmer than the most forbidding prisons, with the important difference that prisoners sometimes escape, whereas from marriage, as it then was, the only escape lay in flight or death. As to polygamy, he makes some telling points. It exhausts men, say the critics, but surely, he replies, overindulgence is possible in monogamy as well. Need varies from one individual to another. Some people take plenty of drink. Others require intensive sex. Polygamy arises where the need arises. I'll say that again. Polygamy arises where the need arises, quote unquote. And he argued that a man can satisfy 4 wives and beget 40 children, a recurrent point in these populationist days. Whereas a husband may make excessive demands on a monogamous wife, which, according to the prevailing views, were bound to interfere with conception. But from these propositions, he gradually works his way around to a position suspiciously close to Lyserian paranoia. Life tied to a wicked husband, he admits, is worse than death. Yes, but for their part, women have an inborn urge to lord it over their men. A wife knows that she has got a husband for life and hence will take any amount of liberties. With polygamy, women would change their tune. They would not only be obedient, but would fight for his favor. Beggar then makes a foray into demography. He rejects the customary view that the number of marriageable men and women are roughly equal, the basic justification for monogamy. More men are killed in battle, on journeys, and in dangerous professions than women, he contends. And if that is not enough to upset the balance between the sexes, there is always the monks and the bachelors. The result is and here the feminist in him comes to the surface, that many a beautiful maiden withers away for want of a mate and eats out her heart in loneliness. There is only one cure: to make the men go round a little further by sanctioning polygamy. And now we have a title, The Monogamist Counterattack, and it goes as follows. Lyser and Beggar were far from being laughed out of court as cranks. They were widely denounced as a danger to public morals, and divines took the trouble of writing lengthy refutations of their works. Most of these attacks are pompous and confused. The best, indeed, the only one that is remotely readable, is called Monogamia. That looks like Monogamia Victrix, a title which was to inspire Lyser's polygamy triumphatrix, and it was published by a German pastor called Johannes Brussmann in Frankfurt in 1679. There is, as might be expected, good straight from the shoulder abuse in unlimited quantities. Lyser is guilty of trying to introduce the diabolical fury of the Turks into the Christian church, and his crime is the more heinous in that he was composed his obscene tracts in German and thus laid a trap for the ignorant citizens instead of reserving his theories, as any decent man would have done, for the learned alone by expounding them in Latin. So, reader's note here. That's very interesting that this particular German pastor is upset that this information is being spilled out into the public domain. He wants only the learned and the sophisticated to be exposed to these theories, of which, of course, they're going to disagree with. But he is concerned about the regular people down at the bottom who are not really educated, and he's concerned about them maybe catching on to some of these ideas, and therefore, in his mind, a cancer would spread. Continuing on. Brussmann not only wrote his book in that language, but indulges for much of its length in theological acrobatics. He counters Lyser's absurd propositions by equally absurd replies. Thus, it is not true, as Lyser maintains, that God did not plan and approve monogamy for Adam. For God looked on creation and found it good, hence God intended the world's first inhabitants to live in monogamy, he argues. But when Brussmann can forget the Bible, he is refreshingly realistic. He insists on the expensiveness of polygamy. It leads, he maintains, straight to beggary. And he has taken the medical aspects of sex seriously. He trounces Lyser's contention that unused semen goes bad. And he does not accept for a moment that women will be content to act like brood hens and renounce intercourse when they are pregnant. Hence, the French gynecologist Ambroise Paré, he shows that when women are pregnant, their need increases. He quotes Solomon to the effect that women are insatiable. Hence, it is truer to say that several men are needed to satisfy one woman than the contrary. One suspects that he had not only studied his authorities, but was speaking from bitter experience. He is remarkably modern in his attitude to population. Marriage, he maintains, is to avoid debauchery, not to stimulate procreation. The earth is full, and there is no danger of the world becoming empty. God, and he might have added instinct, will see to that. It is, of course, a great joy to have children, but they are also a great responsibility. Nobles need heirs, but not one or two males enough. But let me read this again. Nobles need heirs, but are not one or two males enough? Nor is fecundity synonymous with godliness. Nor is fecundity synonymous with godliness. After all, many an impious family in the Old Testament had copious progeny. It is no sin to be a bachelor or childless. Men are free to marry or not as they choose. A revolutionary doctrine in his day, when bachelordom was denounced from the pulpits as an utterly antisocial practice. Procreation is like eating and drinking, indifferent in itself, but bad if abused. Besides, monogamy produces quite enough children, more indeed than polygamy. It is absurd to argue that man is made for polygamy. One might just as well argue that he is made for homicide, adultery, and fornication. Brussmann does not, alas, keep up this high level of discussion. He contends that if, as Lyser suggests, a man seduces a girl in wine and then is able to marry her already, He already has a wife. This will be an inducement for him to persist in his evil ways. In other words, if he seduces a woman in wine and then is able to marry her, although he already has a wife, this will be an inducement for him to persist in his evil ways. In other words, readers know he's making the argument that if you obey the Bible, and which is that sex equals a marriage if a woman is available, I'll make that very clear, if a woman is available, if you, in other words, put in stone that rule as it is written in the scripture, as it's intended to be, then a lot of married men would take the opportunity to try to get maidens drunk. And because they know that the church authorities, if those rules were put into place, would say, "Up, you got to marry her." And then at the end of it all, he would end up with two wives, right? So he says that it's going to be too much of an inducement for that kind of behavior. And while he agrees that cases of sexual frustration will always exist, he takes the ascetic line that prayer and fasting are the answer. And if these are not effective, recourse should be had to the writings of the theologians. The controversy stirred up by Lyser and Becker did not end with Brusman's subsequent refutations. The echoes of the battle echoed far down the 18th century. Gradually, however, the debate changed its character. New Testament criticism, indifference as to the beliefs and practices of the patriarchs, the new science of demography, the rising status of women, and the advent in France of birth control all tended to drive polygamy into the background. The German biblical critic Michaelis made no bones about admitting the existence of plural marriage in the Old Testament and set it in its historical and social perspective. In the same way, the economist and sociologist Sussmilch, in his Divine Order, 1741, with many subsequent additions, dismissed polygamy as undesirable, except in ancient times when wars decimated the male population. Polygamy was then contrary neither to the law of nature nor the rights of other men, and like Luther, he feels that there was some justification for granting special latitude to the ruling families, perhaps some 200 or 300 couples, no doubt mindful of the marked inclination to polygamy of the future kings of Prussia, Frederick William, who was to contract at least 2 marriages of the left hand. The debate did not, of course, end there, but was carried over into the 19th century, and by a writer who was, in fact, the most illustrious German exponent of the need for polygamy. And now we come to a subtitle here. Looks like Schopenhauer. The English have rarely shown excessive enthusiasm for German philosophers or philosophy. At first blush, Schopenhauer, dates 1788 to 1860, would seem to qualify for exemption from this indifference. He took, we are told, regular walks of 2 hours a day, smoked a long pipe, and was an accomplished musician and confirmed diner out. He loved animals and had a pool, which he called Atman, or the world's soul. He had the exceptional merit for a German of writing clearly. He was well versed in English as well as in French and Italian literature and crowned endearment. He was an inveterate reader of the London Times. Yet closer scrutiny reveals less agreeable traits, which are called in German the Schattenseiten. It looks like Schattenseiten. He was a revolutionary or a reactionary. Let me read that again. He was a reactionary in politics and an advocate of authoritarian government. He believed in magic and spiritism. He was inordinately vain and employed correspondents to hunt up evidence of the spread of his fame. He even asserted that several passages in his major work, The World as Will and Idea, published in 1818, were dictated by the Holy Ghost. He was exceedingly quarrelsome and entirely selfish. In short, definitely unclubbable. His outlook, too, was of a somber pessimism, which is hard to match in English philosophy except in Hobbes. We cannot, he asserts, know the objective world. The fundamental reality is the cosmic will, and that is evil. Individual freedom is an illusion. Schopenhauer is, in fact, the forerunner of the irrationalists. From Nietzsche and Wagner to Bergson, and in a way, Freud. So despairing an outlook should lead straight to suicide. Schopenhauer, however, contents himself with preaching but not practicing. The extinction of desire with the aim of attaining a sort of nirvana, as preached by Oriental philosophy, which exercised a profound influence on his thought. The mortification of the flesh includes not only fasting, but chastity, since procreation leads to new life and hence to suffering, culminating in death. Hence, the feeling of shame associated with the sexual act. Schopenhauer, naturally enough, was a confirmed misogynist, and the strength of his conviction increased with age, having thrown an old seamstress downstairs because he was annoyed with her chattering outside his apartment and thereby caused her permanent injury. He was condemned to pay her regular compensation as long as she lived. Oh, they look at that. He seems like a rather not a very nice guy, is he? Reader's note there. Having thrown an old seamstress downstairs because he was annoyed with her chattering outside his apartment and thereby caused her permanent injury, he was condemned to pay her regular compensation as long as she lived. Wow. When she finally died some 20 years after, he expressed his relief with the terse note in his diary, obit anus, obit onus. Dead of the crone, gone the debt. Dead the crone, gone the debt. That's got to be Latin there. Isn't that interesting, that word Latin? It may safely be left to the specialist to decide whether Schopenhauer's aversion to women can be attributed to this episode, to his dislike of his mother, or to his numerous trivial affairs from which, as a bachelor, he derived his knowledge of the eternal feminine. Certainly, his death-oriented, looks like certainly his death-oriented Weltanschauung accords well with his gloomy views on sex and may be largely a rationalization for them. For since, in his opinion, every phenomena is to be interpreted as a manifestation of the all-pervading drive of the will, nothing is easier than to attribute one's personal preferences to its workings, much as the 18th century providentialist discovered the foresight of the divinity in the ribs of a melon, specifically designed so as to facilitate distribution among the members of a large family. Just how far the philosopher carried his a priori reasoning is shown by his demonstration of the underlying purpose of Greek pedastry, which, it might be thought, could not be easily fitted into a universe dominated by the concept of propagation. When the thinker turns his attention to the role of women, he makes out a better case, since he concentrates on their role in perpetuating the species. For her to attain her end, writes Schopenhauer, she must ensnare the deluded male into marrying her, and with that objective in view, she is endowed with, in many cases, with a beauty which is often devastatingly, usually short-lived, and always deceptive. Let me read that again. A beauty which is often devastating, usually short-lived, and always deceptive. What a statement to say. Reader's note there. Women, he asserts in an oft-quoted phrase, is, quote, nature's knockout blow, unquote, which is a way of saying that she gets her man quickly. She has to, the philosopher affirms, for having served their immediate purpose, her charms are lost after one or two confinements, a revealing sidelight on the penalties of childbirth until quite recently. As to the looks like illusoriness of feminine beauty, Schopenhauer does not mince his words. The stunted, narrow-shouldered, full-breasted, and short-legged sex can only be termed the fair one by the male intellect, benighted by the sexual instinct. This guy is a real critic, isn't he? And really, I mean, he's very sharp writing here. He seems to really have a low opinion of women. Continuing on, it follows from all this that women should be brought up to learn domesticity and submissiveness. And the philosopher quotes with approval Byron's annotation on women in Greece to the effect that they should, quote, mind home and read only books of piety and cookery, unquote. However, the quotation goes on, they should be allowed, quote, music, drawing, and dancing, unquote. And in a liberal moment, quote, a little gardening and plowing now and then, since Byron has seen them mending the roads of Epirus with good success, unquote. The actual position of the lady in the West, says Schopenhauer, again quoting Byron, is unnatural and artificial. Her rights, especially in marriage, where she is roughly man's equal, now it's got this sick roughly man's equal, are entirely out of line with their limited capacity. They act as a deterrent to matrimony on the part of the man. This privileged position has as its counterpart the condemnation of countless unmarried girls to the fate of either, quote, useless old maids or prostitutes, unquote. Having thus prepared the ground, Schopenhauer launches out into a vigorous attack on marriage as it existed at the time in Europe. These unwilling spinsters, or recruits to prostitution, he declares, are, quote, human victims on the altar of monogamy, unquote. One can almost hear him adduce Goethe's famous indictment of Christian morality, and it's quoted here: victims crumble here, neither lamb nor steer, only human victims without end, unquote. The remedy for this deplorable state of affairs, says Schopenhauer, is clear. It is the introduction of polygamy, not the underground polygamy which has always prevailed in the West, under which man has little or no responsibility as regards his extramarital attachments, but polygamy on Oriental lines, whereby each wife is looked after by the husband. For woman as a whole, says the philosopher, polygamy is a boon. In other words, he's saying that it's a benefit to women. Reader's note. For women as a whole, says the philosopher, polygamy is a boon. Hence the success of the Mormons, who were right to preach plural marriage, but he admits that the institution benefits men as well, since it largely eliminates his sexual problems. Under the present system, on the contrary, he has little alternative but to look elsewhere when his wife is ill, old, or repulsive. Schopenhauer naturally advances the usual biological arguments in support of his thesis. Nature's aim is to increase the species, and man can engender 100 children a year, whereas women, except he omits to observe in the case of twins, can only bear one child during that period. Hence, monogamy is unnatural. Man is always looking for another woman, and woman is faithfully attached to one man. Fidelity in marriage is thus artificial for man and natural for women. Schopenhauer is on much stronger ground when he places himself, as he does very rarely, in the perspective of history. Up to the Reformation, he asserts, basing himself on the work of an 18th century compatriot, concubinage was common and indeed recognized. It was only when Luther, in ending the celibacy of the clergy, denounced the rights of the additional wife that the practice was banned and degraded. Readers note, very interesting observation there historically, isn't it? Essentially, what he's saying is that underground polygamy flourished in Catholicism, which is the prevailing religious viewpoint in the West until Luther came along, which basically forced it into the limelight. And because it was in the limelight, it was slapped down. You see, that's his point. He continues on here. Once the Protestants had taken so stern a line, the Catholics had no option but to follow suit. Hence these tears. But Schopenhauer's historical insight was limited. He did not see, or probably did not want to see, the signs of an emerging society which was so profoundly to modify women's status and role, and hence consign his ingenious views to the dustbin. And that concludes our reading for today. Now, this is two parts. I had to piece them together into the video, and I'll try to do some editing. I had a couple interruptions there, but I tried to get it as flowing as possible. The next time we have chapter 7, or it looks like chapter 6, rather, The Virtuous Savage and the Enviable Moslem. So essentially, I think we're about 36%. We've got a lot of book left. And there's just a lot of historical stuff in here that, to be honest with you, I really enjoy. And I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. I'm actually enjoying getting back into this reading. And so I'm hoping I'll be able to get far more done continuing on in the future. Also, remember our Sabbath services. We go through the Torah reading, at least for now, and that's at www.yahad.link, yahad.link. And it is at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, USA time, And we welcome you in the services. We'll go over 3 different sections of Scripture, and we pretty much talk about anything scripturally related or even what's going on in your life. We try to make it a pleasant time for everyone. Okay, and so with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and God bless you all.